Sweet mercy, what have you done?
Darkwatch is one of those games where the vibe it's trying to pull off, it really hits you immediately. Even as a kid, that mix of vampires and revolvers and the gothic frontier, that energy just pulled me straight in. I was already into that darker horror tone and other characters around the time like Blade. So the supernatural gunslinger really fit that for me and it just landed immediately. That identity is the first thing you notice in this, and it gives the game a presence that really sticks with you. And revisiting it now brought pieces back that I'd forgotten, like the morality system, the different powers you earn, and the way sunlight affects your strength. Darkwatch leans into this strange world with confidence, creating something that still sparks curiosity the moment you hear its premise. Horror, western, vampire shooter. That's all it takes to make people want to know more.
My name's Tala. Let's mount up.
So, what was Darkwatch? Darkwatch came out in 2005, right at the tail end of the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox generation. And by that point, shooters had settled into familiar lanes. Most games in the genre leaned on modern military ideas, space settings, or just straightforward horror. Anything outside those patterns didn't get a whole lot of attention, and studios rarely drifted towards strange combinations of themes. High Moon Studios decided to try something that didn't match any trend, filled with cursed deserts, frontier towns swallowed by fog, and undead cowboys. It stood out the second you heard that pitch.
Reapers!
When development on Darkwatch began around 2002, the tone didn't look anything like the final product. Early visions leaned toward a brighter style with a different protagonist and a more playful mood. Over the next couple years, the team shifted direction and started pushing towards a heavier tone. They leaned into pulp horror, frontier myth, and darker imagery. That choice shaped everything that came after it. When the team talked about the pitch, they described it as Blade meets Men in Black in the Old West. That line really sums up how they approached the project. They wanted a world built from pulp energy, comic book drama, and supernatural threats that didn't feel tied to the usual shooter setup. Vampires, secret organizations, ghost-ridden trains, rituals in abandoned towns. Even people who never played it often remember the title because there weren't many shooters with this kind of identity. The art direction carried a lot of the weight too. The team wasn't trying to recreate a grounded version of the frontier. They were more interested in what the American West would look like if every outlaw story and campfire tale turned into something violent and haunted. The storms, moonlit ground, the train heist atmosphere, the designs of the undead. All of it came from that idea. You can feel that mindset in the way the levels are framed and in the way characters are presented. The game's world has a clear pulse to it, and the team committed to that tone without hesitation. The timing around the release plays a really big role in how people look back on Darkwatch today. The 6th generation was ending, and studios were already preparing for the jump to the Xbox 360. Mid-sized projects started losing space in the market, especially ones that didn't follow safe ideas. Darkwatch arrived right in that window. It didn't have the marketing push of a bigger franchise, but people who saw it in a magazine or on a store shelf usually reacted to the concept first. A vampire gunslinger on a cursed frontier is the kind of angle that builds curiosity, even if someone never gets around to playing it.
To be careful, you're not as strong as you're used to.
High Moon had plans beyond a single game. Early material hinted at a larger universe with sequels and expanded stories. Those plans never happened, but the ambition shows how serious the studio was about the concept. They treated Darkwatch as a flagship idea, not a small experiment. That intent shows up in the mood and the style and the confidence behind the world building. This is the foundation Darkwatch is built on. A supernatural western released during a crowded transitional period, created by a studio willing to take a chance on a strange idea. The identity of the game explains why people still remember it. Even now, the pitch creates interest before you ever reach the mechanics or the story. That sense of curiosity is the reason I wanted to add Darkwatch to the channel. Darkwatch opens with a pace that feels locked in from the start. The game drops you into one encounter after another without long breaks or slow stretches. Shooters from that era often mixed in puzzles or quieter rooms, but Darkwatch leans toward steady action. You ride into an area, the enemies show up, and the fight snaps into place. The rhythm is simple to understand, and the game builds its entire structure around it. You clear a space, take a few steps forward, and find yourself in the next showdown before your momentum fades. People who grew up on early console shooters will recognize that setup pretty much right away. The flow feels similar to the arena-style pacing people often connect to Halo's older campaigns. You walk into a zone, the enemies climb out of the ground, and the fight stays centered in that space until you take control again. The next piece of the level opens up and the cycle repeats. That loop carries through the entire campaign. Each level feels like a chain of small battlegrounds that feed into each other. That approach is easy to read, and the game makes sure you stay engaged. And then movement ties the whole thing together. Jericho runs with enough speed to reposition when fights start getting busy, and the aiming works well with all the weapons the game gives you. The controls steer you towards quick actions. You step into an arena, pick the threat you want to deal with first, and commit to it. There's no need to overthink anything. The encounters are built for steady pressure instead of scouting and planning. You fall into a forward-moving rhythm that feels natural once you settle into it. The weapons support that pacing. You start with the Redeemer, a handgun that you usually keep on you throughout the whole story. It fires pretty clean and it holds a good number of shots, so you rely on it more than you might expect. As the game goes on, you pick up the carbine, a shotgun, a crossbow that fires explosive arrows. Each weapon lands in a different pocket of that combat flow. The shotgun deals with rushdowns, the carbine handles mid-range fights, and the crossbow creates a burst of impact when the game throws groups at you. Later missions introduce heavier gear like the rocket launcher or the long-range sniper, and those pieces turn certain encounters into quick bursts of destruction. There are moments where the game hands you the scepter. It's a melee weapon that appears in a specific chapter. It's used for close situations when the fight gets cramped. The swings hit hard enough to carve through the enemies, and the sections built around it feel separate from the rest of the gunplay. These parts come and go without lingering too much, and they break the pattern in a way that keeps the pacing pretty fresh. Ammo drops support the entire loop. The game gives you enough to keep moving. You reload when you need to and pick up whatever's on the ground, and then you stay focused on the next push. There's no pressure to treat every bullet like a limited resource. The design leans toward freedom, so you're always encouraged to maintain the pace that the game sets. Once everything clicks, Darkwatch plays with a sense of confidence. The combat pushes you forward, the weapons gives you options without weighing you down, and the encounters fit into a flow that rarely slows down. The game builds its identity around that feeling. Every level and gun and every encounter feeds into the same idea. You step in, take control, and keep moving. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you. I really appreciate you being here, and if you're enjoying it, consider subbing. I'm building an archive and preserving our love for these titles, one game at a time. And every sub helps me keep this going. And a like and a comment also go a really long way. Let me know if you ever played Darkwatch back in the day and what your memories are with it. And if this is your first time seeing it, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. I read every comment and I try to respond to a lot of them. And for anyone watching on mobile, there's also the hype button. Hitting that gives the video hype points, which helps the algorithm push it to more people. It's basically a quick way to say, hey, this is worth watching. And it's a way that you can help grow the video directly. But alright, that's enough of that. Let's get back into Darkwatch.
Holy war. They are the Darkwatch.
One of the big things you notice when you start to settle into Darkwatch is how Jericho moves at night. The game gives you a small set of vampire abilities that sit underneath everything else, and they change the feel of the moment-to-moment action in a pretty big way. These abilities aren't tied to morality, and they don't rely on big decisions. They're part of who he is once the curse hits. And that shows up early enough that they shape how you read the entire campaign. The main piece of that kit is the Blood Shield. It's a layer of protection that sits on top of Jericho's health and comes back on its own. You can feel it working every time you get pulled into a fight. The shots land, the screen shakes, and the shield takes the hit before your health bar starts dropping. It gives you room to stay aggressive without worrying about every stray bullet. The regeneration keeps the pace steady. You finish an encounter, move a few steps, and the shield starts filling again. The flow never slows down, and you're encouraged to stay in the fight rather than backpedal across the level. Then there's the vampire jump. It looks simple, but it changes how you approach a bunch of encounters. Jericho can push off the ground twice. He has a double jump, which lets you reach ledges, dodge enemy attacks, or reposition when a fight starts crowding you. That double jump gives you a way to escape from tight groups and land in a spot where you can reset your aim. It also helps with platforming sections, since some parts of the level layouts are built with that extra burst of height in mind. And once that clicks, you start weaving into your own movement without thinking about it.
Watch out! These people were allies of the Darkwatch.
And then there's blood vision. It rounds out the baseline abilities. It works like a thermal view that highlights enemies and objects that you can interact with. You tap on it, sweep the area, and pick out the next threat. It also acts as a zoom, which helps with longer fights or moments where you need to line up a clean shot. The vision gives you more awareness, and that awareness supports the quick pace the game builds around. You stay locked on the target, avoid getting blindsided, and move with more confidence in darker areas. All three of these abilities play into the overall movement and combat rhythm. The shield keeps you alive, the jump gives you mobility, and the vision helps you track threats. Together they give Jericho this presence that separates him from the usual gunslinger you'd expect from a Western setting. And once the sun goes down, these tools shape how every encounter opens and ends. They act as the foundation of the morality powers you unlock later, and they carry the energy of the game from the early missions all the way to the end. The game starts adding more personality once the morality system shows up. The game pulls you into a set of choices at certain points in the story, and those decisions shape the kind of powers Jericho develops. It's a simple system to understand, and it ends up giving you two ways to grow depending on how you respond to those moments. The morality choices come in a couple of forms. Some levels hide tortured souls that you can interact with. When you find one, the game gives you a decision about what to do with them. You can lift them out of their suffering or push them deeper into it. Other choices appear during the story, where certain characters end up in danger, and you decide how Jericho responds. Each decision pushes you down a path, and the game tracks that progress as you move through the campaign.
Jericho. That's all she's good for.
As you make those decisions, you start unlocking powers called brands. These aren't tied to items or level ups. They reflect whatever direction your choices have been leading you. If you stay on the good side, the game gives you abilities that help you survive more hits or create openings in large groups. A couple of examples are Silver Bullet, which boosts the strength of your shots, and Mystic Armor, which adds another layer of protection above your blood shield. Powers like that make long fights easier to manage, especially in areas where enemies come from different angles. If you spend the game taking the darker path, the powers show up in a different style. They focus more on overwhelming enemies or pulling health back into your bar. Blood Frenzy is one of the earlier examples. It throws Jericho into a state where he can swing harder and take direct hits without dropping. Another example is Soul Stealer, which tears through nearby enemies and feeds you the energy they leave behind. These abilities turn you into a kind of fighter who gets stronger the more trouble you walk into. Every power uses the same resource. When enemies fall, they release souls. Those souls refill a blood meter in the corner of the screen. Once the meter fills, you can trigger whichever brand you have selected. The meter goes back down after the effect ends, and you start filling it again by fighting more enemies. Souls also restore your health, which creates a loop where the best way to stay alive is to stay active. The morality system doesn't take over the whole game, but it adds flavor to every mission. You commit to a certain path, and the powers you gain follow that direction. One path gives you more room to stay steady in rough encounters, and the other path gives you tools that tilt things towards raw force. No matter which direction you pick, the system adds another layer to the action and gives Jericho a clear identity by the time you reach the later missions. One of the smartest ideas in Darkwatch shows up in how the game handles the shift between night and day. The two states don't just change the lighting or the mood. They change how Jericho functions. When the game drops you into a night mission, you have access to all your vampire abilities, the shield, the double jump, the vision, and whatever morality powers you've earned are all ready to use. The fights move faster, and you feel more capable of handling whatever the game puts in front of you. Once you get used to that flow, it becomes the natural rhythm of the campaign. But then you hit a daytime section, and the tone shifts. All the abilities that make Jericho feel supernatural disappear. You move, shoot, and dodge like a human. You start relying on cover, distance, and weapon choice in a more deliberate way. The game doesn't frame this change as punishment, it's simply a different state. The encounters work with that idea, and the pacing adjusts around it. You lean into your guns, watch your spacing, and pick your targets with more care.
Step back, heathen! I'm gonna blow the barricade!
These moments give you a clear sense of what Jericho is going through after the curse. The difference between night and day is easy to feel once you've played a few missions. The loss of your vampire abilities creates a shift in how you read the battlefield. Certain jumps you would normally clear without thinking become out of reach. Dodging through crowds take more effort, and you notice how much the shield carried you in earlier missions. The game uses this gap to remind you that Jericho still has limitations. It gives him a weakness that fits the world without slowing things down. One interesting design choice is the way the game handles sunlight. Jericho doesn't take direct damage from it. There's no countdown, no burning effect, no pressure to sprint from shade to shade. Instead, the game just removes your powers and leaves you with your human abilities. That approach keeps the flow steady. You deal with the challenge of losing your tools without dealing with constant chip damage or timers. The pacing stays smooth, and the mission structure remains focused on action instead of managing a negative effect. The day sections work because of that restraint. They remind you that Jericho's strength is tied to the night, and they change the way you approach the level. You rely on clean aim, good positioning, and steady movement, and when the sun finally goes down again in later missions, the return of your abilities hits with more impact. You regain your jump, your vision, and your shield, and the powers you've collected on your morality path. It feels like stepping back into the version of Jericho you've been building. This system creates a natural rhythm across the story. Night feels empowering, and days slow things down enough to give the next rush of abilities more weight. The game never spells that out directly, but you feel it in every encounter. The shift between forms becomes part of the experience, and it gives the action a sense of rise and fall that fits the world Darkwatch builds around Jericho. The overall core loop in the game is consistent, but it breaks things up with a few mission types that stand out from the regular on-foot shooting. The first big shift happens when you climb onto Shadow, Jericho's undead horse. This section plays like a rail shooting sequence, where you ride along a set path and handle enemies as they chase you down the trail. You can speed up or slow down to adjust your position, but the main focus stays on aiming and clearing whatever jumps out of the dark. The controls for Shadow are simple, and the game treats these moments almost like a break from the usual structure. You fall into a different rhythm, and the ride carries a certain charm because the movement blends with the world in a natural way. Shadow is described in the manual as tireless and undead, and the horse lives up to that idea. You don't manage stamina or anything like that. You just press forward, keep your eyes on the screen, and shoot as enemies close in. These sections help reset your pacing. After a string of arena-style encounters, the rail mission gives you a controlled path, where the action sweeps by you instead of making you circle around the cover. It's a small change, but it shifts your mindset enough to keep things fresh.
Okay, here's where we leave the tracks. We're almost to the Citadel.
Another type of variation shows up when you enter the Coyote Steam Wagon. This is a vehicle mission where Jericho drives a steam-powered cart equipped with twin Gatling guns. The wagon moves in the same basic way Jericho walks. The left stick steers the direction and the aiming follows that turn, kind of like Halo's Warthog. The guns fire without any ammo limit, which helps the section move smoothly. You steer, hold down the trigger, and clear enemies as they rush the vehicle. You also lose access to your vampire jumps and your vision while you're actually on the turret, so the focus stays on driving and shooting. The mission plays out pretty quickly, and the wagon gives the level a distinct identity without overshadowing the rest of the game.
It's your only defense!
About halfway through the game introduces a small hub area inside the Darkwatch base. This section doesn't last long, but it stands out because the structure shifts for a moment. You walk through the halls, talk to a few characters, and pick from a selection of missions. You choose the order, and the game lets you decide which weapons to carry into the next job. It's not like a full open hub or really anything close to it, but the small touch helps the campaign feel less linear for that brief stretch. It hints at a larger world behind the organization and gives you a light sense of choice. Even though you eventually have to complete every mission on the list, the moment still feels different from the rest of the game. And these pieces work together to shape Darkwatch's pacing. You spend most of your time just jumping around and running and shooting, moving from arena to arena. But the game pulls you aside now and then to give you something fresh. A rail mission on Shadow, a burst of destruction in the wagon, a brief turret stand, or a short walk through the base. It all supports the campaign's momentum. None of these segments overstay their welcome, and each one adds a little flavor before the game returns you to the main loop. And the variety helps the action stay pretty fresh across the whole story.
Board at the ladder.
After all those mechanics settle in and you start getting a feel for how Darkwatch plays, at that point, the thing that keeps pulling you forward is the world itself. The game has a look that sticks with you. It's this strange mix of gothic horror and frontier grit, and it shows up in pretty much every part of the game. A lot of that comes from the way the environments are put together. You move through the old train stations, ghost towns, graveyards, and long stretches of desert that feel drained of anything living. The lighting leans toward heavy skies, dark corners, and a moonlit ground. The frontier already has its own sense of isolation, and the game layers supernatural touches on top of that. It creates this uneasy atmosphere where the Old West feels haunted in a way that fits the tone without calling attention to itself. The enemies help sell that mood too. You run into undead cowboys that drag themselves forward like they've been stuck in the dirt for years. Then you've got banshees that float across the screen with wide sweeping movements, and later on the game throws bigger creatures at you with shapes and proportions that look pulled from old pulp artwork. None of it tries to hide what it is. The design feels bold and clear the moment they pop up in front of you. Jericho's appearance plays into the overall style as well. His look changes a little bit as the curse takes hold, and you can see it in the way his eyes shift and the way the darker traits start creeping into his design. His coat, his weapons, the shape of his stance. It all helps him feel like someone shaped by the chaos around him. He looks like he belongs in this world, which keeps the tone consistent even when the action gets heavier.
Giddy up, cowboy. My name's Tala. Let's mount up.
Cassidy and Tala add their own touches to that style. Cassidy has this cleaner, more structured look that fits the organized side of Darkwatch. Tala carries a looser, wilder vibe that lines up with parts of the frontier that aren't under control. Both of them help fill the edges of the world just by how they're designed. You can get a sense of the factions and the tone without the story spelling everything out. The sound work pulls the whole atmosphere together. You get this mix of western twang mixed with darker and moodier notes that echo the supernatural side of the game. Storms roll through certain sections, wind cuts across the desert, and saloons creak in a way that puts you in the moment. Even small things like footsteps on wooden floors or gunshots echoing in open spaces help the world feel more present. The cutscenes fit that same identity. They're animated in a stylized comic book kind of way, with bold framing and heavy shading. It gives the game the feel of a pulp story being told piece by piece, which lines up with the rest of the presentation. They don't try to look realistic, they try to look striking, and that approach works for the kind of world Darkwatch builds. All this comes together to give the game a clear sense of style. The environments, characters, enemies, sound, and cinematics all support that same tone. Even when the gameplay becomes familiar, the look and the feel of the world keep you interested. The style is the part people remember the most. And it's the reason Darkwatch still gets brought up whenever someone starts talking about forgotten games with strong identity. Once you get a feel for the world Darkwatch builds, the story sits right in the middle of all that tone. The plot has a clear pulp energy to it, and it moves fast enough to match the rest of the game. Everything starts with Jericho Cross. He's an outlaw looking for quick money, and he decides to hit one last train. The job looks simple when he sets it up, but the train belongs to Darkwatch, and they're transporting something locked up for a reason. Jericho breaks into the wrong car, releases Lazarus, and gets bitten. That moment sets the entire story in motion. He doesn't get the chance to process any of it before the situation snowballs. Lazarus is the central threat. He's an old vampire with a long history of destruction, and Darkwatch has been trying to contain him for years. Once he escapes, the frontier fills with undead creatures, corrupted lands, and haunting attacks across small towns and remote outposts. Jericho ends up getting pulled into the organization he just robbed. They want his curse contained, and they want someone who can track Lazarus through the places regular soldiers wouldn't survive. Jericho fits that role, even if it's the last thing he wanted. Two figures shape the story from that point, Cassidy and Tala. Cassidy represents the cautious and disciplined side of Darkwatch. She tries to keep Jericho focused and helps him make sense of the curse. Tala carries a more unpredictable energy. She pushes Jericho into directions that aren't always stable, and her connection to him grows as the story moves forward. The tension between them gives the narrative its strongest pull. They both want something from Jericho, and the way you handle certain choices determines how their paths end. The game uses these relationships to carry a set of themes that fit the horror western setting. Jericho's curse becomes a constant reminder of how thin the line is between strength and corruption. Every time he uses his powers, he steps a little deeper into something he never wanted. The frontier becomes a backdrop for that abandoned struggle. You travel through empty towns, ruined churches, and ancient burial sites, and long trails filled with abandoned markers. The land feels caught between two forces. You see that tension everywhere you go, from the enemies you fight to the way the world reacts to the presence of Lazarus. There's also a thread about identity. Jericho starts as a man who makes his own decisions, then gets caught in a situation where his body doesn't fully belong to him anymore. The curse tries to steer him one way, the mission pulls him another. That conflict gives the story its weight. You see the pieces of who he was trying to hang on while the new parts of him grow stronger. The morality system in the gameplay ties into this idea. The path you choose becomes less about good and evil and more about how Jericho handles the thing inside him. And by the time you reach the end, the story gives you two outcomes. One path leads Jericho to a form of closure, where he faces what he's become and he tries to set the land right. The other path turns him into the kind of monster Darkwatch is trying to stop. Both outcomes feel like they belong to the same world. They match the pulp tone and the supernatural framework the game builds around every character. Darkwatch doesn't tell a complicated story, but it carries a strong sense of direction. It mixes frontier legends, cursed power, desperate alliances, and the idea of fighting something older than the land itself. The plot stays focused on Jericho's transformation and the cost of unleashing Lazarus. The themes sit close to the surface without taking over, and the game delivers them with enough clarity to give the world a sense of weight. It fits the tone that we had just talked about, and it gives the rest of the game something solid to stand on. By the time you reach the end of Darkwatch, it feels like a game that should have turned into something bigger. The world, the style, and the setup all feel like the starting point for a series, but it never grew past the first release. Once you look at the timing around it, it becomes a little bit clearer. Like I had mentioned in the very beginning, the game came out in 2005, right at the tail end of the PS2 in the original Xbox era. The next generation was already forming. The Xbox 360 was on shelves that same year, and all the attention was shifting toward what the new hardware could do. Studios were preparing tech demos, and publishers were funneling resources towards launch titles, and the whole industry was looking forward. A game like Darkwatch landed in a space where people were ready to move on, even if the game had something interesting to offer. Mid-tier experiments had a hard time keeping momentum during that shift, and Darkwatch was one of them. The other factor was what happened behind the scenes. The team that made Darkwatch had plans for a full franchise. There were early talks about sequels, a movie, maybe comics. They were preparing a follow-up and even showed parts of it while looking for publisher support. Then the studio went through ownership changes, and the new direction leaned towards safer projects, instead of being encouraged to keep building their own worlds. The team started working on licensed games and larger IPs. Darkwatch didn't fit into that plan, so the sequel never made it out of its prototype stage. The moment those doors closed, the entire franchise stalled. There was also the question of how to sell a game like this at the time. A vampire gunslinger in a horror western world has a strong hook, but it sits outside the genres that were pulling the biggest crowds. The mid-2000s were leaning towards military shooters and grounded war stories, and more realistic presentations. Games with that tone were dominating shelves and grabbing most of the marketing budgets. A supernatural cowboy fighting banshees and undead outlaws didn't slot into that picture. Even though Darkwatch had a clear identity, it wasn't the kind of identity publishers were prioritizing. When you put all that together, Darkwatch ended up living in a strange space. The game had solid reviews and players who loved what it tried to do. The setting had room to grow and the story left plenty of threads to follow, but timing, studio direction, and industry trends pulled it down before it had a chance to expand. Without a sequel, the game faded from shelves and eventually slipped into a cult status. People who played it remember the world and the atmosphere, but it never became a name you'd see repeated across a generation. And looking back now, Darkwatch feels like a reminder of how many interesting ideas came out of that era, and never had the opportunity to develop further. It had a style that could have grown into something big. It had a world that could have carried future stories. It just landed in a moment where the industry was shifting too quickly for a new franchise to take root. And what's left is a single game with a strong sense of identity held up by the people who still talk about it whenever the subject of forgotten titles comes up.
You're on the right path, Jericho. Using good powers might save your soul.
After everything, it becomes clear why Darkwatch still comes up in conversations about forgotten games. There aren't many titles that tried to mix a supernatural frontier with fast, arcade-leaning gunplay, and even fewer that held onto that idea with real commitment. Darkwatch feels like one of those projects where the team had a specific vision, and they built everything around it. The result is a world that sticks with people long after the details of the mission fade. The setting plays a huge part in that, and there's something memorable about a frontier full of curses, undead riders, and haunted towns, and an outlaw trying to outrun his own transformation. The game creates a version of the West that feels shaped by legend as much as history. That approach makes the world feel bigger than the runtime. Even though Darkwatch never grew into a series, the atmosphere leaves enough room for imagination to keep going. People still bring it up years later for that reason. The tone works the same way. Darkwatch carries a clear pulp identity that matches the era it came from. Early 2000s games often leaned into strong concepts even when they didn't aim to redefine anything. And this is a perfect example. The game isn't trying to shake the industry, it's trying to deliver a striking world with a strong hook and a main character caught in a dangerous situation. That focus gives it personality. You feel the team chasing an idea they believed in, and the end result holds up because of that commitment.
This just makes it easier.
Darkwatch also feels like a time capsule. The design choices, the cutscenes, the UI, the music, and the overall vibe capture that period in gaming before trends tightened and mid-sized projects began disappearing. A lot of games from that window took swings with a strong identity, and Darkwatch is one of the clearest examples of what that looked like.
Oh, I hate those things.
Every once in a while, a modern game comes along that gives off a similar energy. Evil West is a good example. It leans in that same pulpy frontier mood, a world twisted by dark forces with characters who feel larger than life. Seeing a game like that pop up almost 20 years later shows how much space there is for this kind of setting. It lets you imagine what Darkwatch could have grown into if the industry had kept room for bold supernatural westerns. The connection isn't one-to-one, but the vibe sits in the same family. And it highlights how strong this aesthetic can be when a team commits to it. Even with its limits, Darkwatch left a mark. It didn't grow into a series, it didn't make the jump to newer consoles, and it never reached the audience it probably deserved. But the idea of a cursed gunslinger fighting through a haunted frontier still feels ripe today. You see little flashes of that DNA living on in games like Evil West, and it reminds you how ahead of its time Darkwatch really was. That's the kind of impact that sticks, even when a project only gets one entry. Darkwatch deserves a place in Jake's save room because it represents a type of game that can disappear if nobody holds on to it. It has a look, a tone, and a world that offers something distinct. When a game like that starts to fade out of the public eye, it's easy for it to get buried under bigger releases and modern expectations. Bringing it back into the conversation keeps that spark alive, and it shows how much room there still is for strange, stylish ideas, and how a single project can leave a lasting impression even without a long-running franchise. But if you've made it all the way to the end, I really appreciate you. Thank you. I appreciate you for spending the time with me. And if you enjoyed the video, consider subbing. A like and a comment helps a lot also. Maybe a little bit more than you think. And for the mobile viewers, there's also the hype button. Consider hitting that if you enjoyed the video. It really does help grow the video directly and pushes it to a wider audience. But I appreciate you all, and as always, I'll see y'all later.
The Darkwatch.